Hi, I'm Corey, and this is my first trimester's video essay. So, first of all, I want to introduce the overview of my journey as a practitioner. And before starting this module, my understanding of filmmaking was mostly based on intuition and final outcomes. I usually began with an idea of feeling and then push the project forward through trial and error. However, I rarely stop to reflect on my position within the creative process, the responsibility I was taking, or how my method choices were shaping my decisions. This module didn't simply help me learn new technical skills, but to be honest, I did learn some new technical skills like the sound, like the camera I never touched before, but instead, it pushed me to look closely at how I work and why I work in this way. I began to realize that what matters is not only what kind of work I make, but how I arrive at it. During this module, I took on three different roles across three projects: screenwriter, producer, and director. Moving between these roles meant that I was not always in control of creative decisions. When I had creative authority, I focused more on expression and form. When I was placed outside the creative center, I became more aware of structure, limits, and practical conditions. Through this shift in position, I gradually moved away from a goal-driven mindset and started to pay more attention to practice itself. Looking back, I can see that this change didn't happen in a single moment. It developed through a continuous process across the module. In the storytelling block, I first encountered the idea of defamiliarization as a personal feeling while keeping a reading journal. In the established practice block, my role as a producer placed me at a distance from creative control. Finally, in the innovative practice block, I actively explored this sense of distance through form and perception as a director. What began as an unclear feeling slowly became a method that I could analyze and choose, rather than treating these three projects as separate outcomes. This video essay understands them as one connected journey. Through reflection and comparison, I will explore how I moved from an intuition-led creator to a more method-aware practitioner, and how I began to use creative practice itself as a way of thinking. So in terms of how I worked, there are two ways I want to introduce. First one is core method. My core method is very special. At the start of every project, I spend time exploring ideas and gathering inspiration. This does not only mean watching similar films. I also try to experience situations that can connect it to the project in real life. For me, ideas come from direct observation and personal experience, rather than copying existing forms. This exploration is guided by a clear intention. I often try to make familiar experiences feel unfamiliar, creating a sense of distance. During this stage, I test different perspectives and ideas, and then select only those that are most closely connected to the core of the project. This helps me avoid of collecting material without direction. At the same time, I focus strongly on planning. I break the project into clear stages and set priorities early on. This allows me to understand the overall process and manage my time effectively. I usually focus my energy first on the most difficult and important problems. And once these are resolved, the rest of the project can move forward more smoothly. This approach, moving from focused thinking to structured execution, has become my core working method across different projects. So the second working method for me is how rational thinking, intuition, and inspiration work together. In my creative process, rational thinking, inspiration, and intuition do not work against each other. Instead, they form a system that depends on constant adjustment. In most cases, inspiration comes first. It often comes from everyday experience, emotional states, or a sudden association in a specific situation. At this stage, ideas are usually unclear and incomplete, but they provide the initial energy to begin a project. After that, intuition starts to play a role. For me, intuition is not a random impulse. It is shaped by past experience, viewing habits, and personal taste. It helps me quickly decide which directions are worth exploring further and which can be put aside. Here, intuition is mainly about choosing direction rather than solving problems. However, relying only on inspiration and intuition often leaves the work vague or driven only by feeling. This is where rational thinking becomes important. Instead of replacing intuition, I use rational thinking to test and examine earlier decisions. I do this by analyzing structure, testing ideas, checking feasibility, and returning to the core aim of the project. This process is close to what Donna Shore describes as reflection within practice. As he writes, reflection in action is a reflective conversation with the situation. In this sense, creative decisions are not fixed in advance, but formed through action and response. Through this way of working, I have learned that effective creations is not about choosing between intuition and rational thinking. It is about keeping them in balance, allowing inspiration to remain alive, while also shaping it into clear and structured decisions. Now, turning to the third one, theory and practitioner research. There are three parts of this. First one is practice as research. During this module, I gradually began to understand my practice as a form of thinking in action, rather than something fully planned in advance. Many important decisions were not made before the work started, but emerged through doing, adjusting, and looking back at the process. Often it was only after completing a stage of the work that I could clearly see which choices were effective and which were driven by habit rather than intention. This way of working shifted my
I think the curtains
focus
is a good way to
from
go about it. Yeah.
whether a project was successful as an outcome to what the process itself was revealing. As a result, creation became a continuous reflective process rather than a linear plan to be executed. This also changed how I understood mistakes. Failure was no longer something to simply avoid, but a point where my methods, position, and decision-making could be questioned and refined. So the second one is defamiliarization as a method of perception. One of the key concepts that gradually shaped my practice during this module is defamiliarization, originally developed in literary theory. The idea describes how art can disrupt habitual perception by making familiar experiences appear strange or unfamiliar, rather than allowing the audience to recognize something automatically. Defamiliarization slows down perception and forces attention back onto the experience itself. For me, this concept offered a way to articulate what I had previously understood only as a feeling, a sense of distance or detachment within my work. As I began to apply this idea to moving imagery practice, defamiliarization shifted from a theoretical concept to a practical method. I started to question how narrative structure, rhythm, repetition, and visual framing could interrupt normal expectations and resist smooth conception. Instead of guiding the viewer forward through clear progression, I became more interested in creating moments of pause, uncertainty, or dislocation. The last one, narrative, temporality, and habitual perception. As my practice developed, I became less interested in using narrative to push a story forward, and more interested in how narrative shapes habitual ways of viewing. Traditional narrative relies on clear progression and cause and effect, which also trains the audience to expect smooth understanding. By using repetition, delay, and non-goal-oriented structures, I began to weaken narrative function and make time itself more noticeable. Rather than guiding the viewer forward, this approach draws attention to the act of watching. Now we get to the most exciting part, my portfolio projects. First one is the storytelling block. So this one is the first practice in this module where my interest in distance became clear. At the beginning, my inspiration came from the TV series Gotham. I was drawn to its dense plotting and constant twists. The narrative leaves little space for rest, and the continuous reversals work as a mechanism that keeps breaking the viewer's expectations. This viewing experience led me to think about real social environments, especially the workplace, where power, identity, and hidden competition shape everyday behavior. My initial intention was to use narrative to expose these hidden structures and reveal a more aggressive social reality. However, at this stage, my ideas stayed at a thematic level. I had a broad concept, but no clear plot or practical plan. As the writing progressed, I realized that this large-scale idea was impossible to execute within the limits of the project. At this point, I began to question my method. Instead of relying on complex themes or world building, I started to consciously introduce distance as a narrative strategy. This shift was influenced by my experience of watching everything everywhere all at once. This film is gorgeous, and it does not build credibility through realistic logic, but through strong visual engagement, sudden shifts, and emotional breaks. This made me realize that distance does not require a grand concept. It can be created by structural reversals and by disrupting viewing expectations. So based on this understanding, I made a key decision in the script. I stopped trying to represent a complex social system and focused instead on a controlled situation. The story developed into a campus bullying narrative, where twists became the main way to force the audience to re-evaluate characters and situations. However, this project also revealed clear problems in my early decision-making. I failed to properly consider production limits. Although the tutor had already set clear constraints, I became too absorbed in the story idea and ignored practical feasibility. This became obvious when key props could not be used for safety reasons. For example, a gun had to be replaced with an SX, which directly affect the logic of action and weaken the narrative structure. In this sense, the storytelling block was not only a script-writing exercise, it was the first time I clearly realized that creative methods themselves need to be designed. Distance is not only produced by iteration, it must be constantly adjusted through structure, conditions, and critical judgment. My second project, Establish Practices block. This one is the only project in this module where I worked entirely in a non-authorial role. In this project, I mainly took responsibility as a producer and sound recordist. My focus was on production coordination, workflow management, and technical execution of sound, rather than leading creative decisions. To be honest, this role placed me structurally outside the creative core of the project. Compared to the previous work, I was no longer expressing my own ideas through narrative or form. Instead, I needed to support an already defined creative direction. Although I didn't have a strong influence on the project's aesthetic or narrative outcomes, this experience had an important indirect impact on my later practice. It forced me to step away from an author-centered perspective to understand filmmaking as a collaborative process shaped by roles, responsibilities, and limitations. Looking back, this position outside the creative center strengthened my understanding of production structures. When I returned to an authorial role in later projects, this experience helped me engage with constraints and teamwork more consciously, and to take greater responsibility for the practical consequences of creative decisions. The final project is the one I'm most proud of. It's the Innovative Practices blog, and I made what I consider to be the most radical decision of this module. Instead of trying to produce a finished work in a traditional sense, I decided to treat the process of making the work itself as the work. This was a very deliberate shift for me. In most of my previous projects, the creative process was something invisible. It happened behind the scenes, and once the final outcome was complete, the process disappeared. So the audience was only meant to see the result, not the thinking, the uncertainty, or the mistake that led to it. In this project, I wanted to reverse that logic. I chose to make my own creative process visible and to place it at the center of the work. Thinking, hesitation, searching, repetition, and even moments of confusion were no longer problems to be edited out. They became the material of the film. What is important to say here is that this idea didn't come from a clear theoretical plan. It was highly intuitive. It felt as if it appeared suddenly in my head, almost fully formed, rather than being carefully developed over time. At the beginning of the project, I didn't have a list of references, and I was not consciously trying to place my work within a specific tradition. I realized that whenever I tried to explain creativity in a clear or logical way, the explanation felt false. My actual experience of creating was messy, interrupted, and often contradictory. So, rather than explaining creativity, I decided to show what it feels like to be inside it. This decision also led to a major change in structure. I abandoned conventional narrative development and replaced it with a three-part structure: wake, searching, and everything creative. These stages do not represent a story. They represent shifts in perception and mental state. They are based on my own experience of moving in and out of focus while working, rather than on any external plot. Visually, I use techniques such as time-lapse, slow motion, rapid cutting, distortion, and close-up textures. The goal was not to communicate information, but to destabilize familiar spaces and actions. By doing this, I want to interrupt the viewer's automatic way of watching. It prevents the viewer from quickly understanding what is happening and instead keeps them in a state of awareness. In this way, time itself becomes something that can be felt, rather than simply passed through. Sound was equally important to this process. I structured the sound design around a heartbeat rhythm, moving from slow to fast, and then returning to calm, rather than supporting the image emotionally. The sound acts as an internal tempo, guiding changes in perception. Image and sound work together to create a psychological rhythm rather than a narrative one. Towards the end of the film, I made another key decision. I deliberately broke the constructed world of the piece by cutting back to myself editing at the computer. This moment is not meant to resolve the film. Instead, it works as a reminder. It reminds the viewer that what they have been watching is not a natural or objective experience. It is something that has been designed, shaped, and edited. By exposing this moment, I wanted to avoid presenting the film as neutral or invisible. The work openly amidst its own construction. Only after completing the project did I begin to research similar works. Through its process, I discovered that there are experimental and essay films that also treat the act of making as part of the artwork itself. This discovery didn't make the project feel less original to me. Instead, it helped me understand that my practice was connected to a wider field of experimental filmmaking. In this sense, the last project became more than a formal experiment. It was the first time I truly experienced creative practice as a form of research. The project does not aim to provide clear answers. Instead, it offers a space where thinking remains visible, incomplete, and open. Looking back, I see this project as a turning point. It confirmed for me that experimental film doesn't need to escape meaning in order to be valid. It can function as a way of thinking through images, time, and perception. If I were to develop this project further, I would aim to strengthen the internal logic of the structure without reducing its openness. The challenge would be deepen the relationship between method and perception, while still allowing certainty to remain. For me, this balance between control and instability has become one of the most important outcomes of the module. Finally, is the reflection of my whole module. As I reflected on my creative methods, I gradually became aware that defamiliarization, as a perceptual strategy, is not ethically neutral. By weakening narrative cues, delaying information, and interrupting rhythm, moving image can place the audience in an unstable viewing state. If used without restraint, this method risks becoming a form of emotional manipulation, where confusion itself is treated as an aesthetic effect. Because of this, I learned that applying defamiliarization also requires ethical judgment. Throughout the creative process, I repeatedly asked myself whether this sense of distance was still serving to reawaken perception, or whether it had shifted into a form of stylistic display. This self-questioning led me to deliberately leave visible traces of construction within the work. For example, by ending the film with a return to the editing space itself, I aimed to remind the viewer that what they were experiencing was not natural or accidental, but consciously designed. In terms of authenticity, I didn't aim to use moving image to represent an objective reality. Instead, I treated the work as a subjective presentation of creative consciousness by exposing the editing process and my own position as the creator. I avoided presenting the image as a neutral observation. Authenticity, in this sense, doesn't come from faithfully reproducing reality, but from being transparent about the process through which the work is constructed. Overall, this module didn't provide me with a fixed creative answer. Instead, it helped me develop a sustained awareness of reflection and self-correction within practice. What I learned as a practitioner was not a specific technique, but the ability to continuously question my methods, make conscious choices, and take responsibility for their outcomes. This capacity to think through practice, rather than simply produce work, will form the foundation of my future creative development.